Welcome to our conference on addictions, old and new. So for our first presenter, David Courtwright, professor of history at the University of North Florida, and this year's Freeman Professor of History at the University of Richmond. In addition to organizing and leading this conference on addictions, old and new, David is teaching our undergraduates about the history of medicine and disease this semester. He is best known for his work on drug use and drug policy, and for such books as Dark Paradise, Addicts Who Survived, and Forces of Habit. Recently, he has begun to write about the larger history of pleasure, commercialized vice, and addiction. His talk today is Food as a Drug. How good is the analogy? David.
You see coca tea, poppy seeds, cannabis desserts, red and white wine, and beer. And if I were to ask you whether these things are foods or drugs, you would probably say, well, they have properties of both. Coca tea contains vitamins, iron, calcium, and enough cocaine to produce a positive drug test. Poppy seeds contain traces of morphine. The amount depends on the way in which they're processed. And yet cooks add poppy seeds to bagels and muffins and other foods that can also produce positive drug tests. Ditto cannabis, a drug and fiber plant that also provides edible seeds and oils, and which has enjoyed something of a revival in haute cuisine as a part of the cannabis revival. Beer and wine provide calories, vitamins, minerals, flavonoids, and ethanol, which is a crossover molecule that is a drug and an energy source. Liquid bread, which comes from a series in anthropology significantly titled Food and Nutrition, evokes beer's dual role. Indeed, beer soup, which was ale or beer mixed with bread and other ingredients, was a breakfast staple in Europe prior to the revolution in caffeinated beverages, which changed dietary customs. And even then, there were holdouts. One was Louis XIV's sister-in-law, the German-born Elizabeth Charlotte, Duchesse d'Orléans. All this foreign stuff is repugnant to me, she complained in a 1704 letter from Versailles. I find chocolate too sweet, coffee tastes like soot, and tea is more like a medicine. She preferred a good Kaltschale, which is a cold soup which is made from wine and beer and bread. She took her warm beer with imported sauerkraut and sausages, fare of which she was evidently too fond. I have a horrendous behind, a big belly and hips, and very broad shoulders, she wrote in 1699. I am hideously ugly, but fortunately for me, I care not one whit. Although I should tell you that at least one biographer has doubted the sincerity of those words. If alcohol-enhanced foods tempted some to gluttony, spice-enhanced foods tempted others to lechery. Pepper and cinnamon were the Viagra and Cialis of the Middle Ages. Confessors inquired whether penitents had indulged in spicery in a way that had led them to sin. Yet spices also had laudatory uses as treatments for common diseases. Context was all. To quote the anthropologist Stephen Hugh Jones, the three-way contrast between food and drugs and medicines appears to be historically quite recent and confined to industrial societies. It does not map easily onto the way that substances are categorized elsewhere. The spice bazaar could be a grocery, a pharmacy, an open-air drug market, or all three. Chewing tobacco offers another historical case. 19th century manufacturers routinely added sugar, glycerol, rum, licorice, and other ingredients that contemporaries thought of as food, drink, or spice. While tobacco was an addictive drug and recognized as such, there was more socially and nutritionally to chewing tobacco than a simple nicotine fix. Tobacco food mixtures also had medicinal applications. This particular ointment used tobacco, hog fat, and red wine. Doctors also administered tobacco internally. To blow smoke up one's arse, a phrase that now means to get a reaction of someone through flattery, had a quite literal meaning in the late 18th century, which was the golden age of the tobacco enema. So, for historians and anthropologists, the question, food as a drug, how good is the analogy, practically answers itself. It's a good analogy because in many eras and cultures, foods have functioned as and have been blended with drugs and vice versa. And in fact, anthropologists often use the hyphenated phrase food drugs as shorthand for this phenomenon. The food drug idea has taken a scientific turn. Psychologists like Kelly Brunel, neuroscientists like Nora Volkoff, public health authorities like David Kessler, journalists like Michael Moss, have all claimed that hyperpalatable foods containing sugar, salt, and fat can themselves be addictive. In other words, certain foods are addictive drugs. The gist of this op-ed by a research scientist and a public health doctor that recently appeared in the New York Times. Lay people express similar views. This video, one of dozens on the topic, features members of a group called Food Addicts in Recovery Anonymous. They describe their plight, and if you listen in, you will hear language that is essentially indistinguishable from what you would hear among recovering alcoholics attending an AA meeting. Addiction neuroscientist Mark Gold writes, some would say if it quacks like a duck, it is a duck. Food, highly palatable and energy dense, has become a substance of abuse. So let's call this position the strong analogy between food and addictive drugs. I'll consider objections to it in a moment. But first, let's unpack the analogy. Why do food addicts look like other addicts? What's the case for the strong analogy? First, food addicts look like other addicts because they display cue-sensitive, craving-driven, compulsive behavior. The behavior persists despite elevated morbidity and mortality, large personal and social costs, and deep regret. You end up standing at the kitchen counter in front of an empty pie plate, feeling sick to your stomach and full of remorse and self-loathing. These are the words of a self-described food addict who happens also to be an Episcopal priest. These same feelings prompt entry into treatment regimens and programs. Second, food addicts' brains look like other addicts' brains. They show signs of neurochemical changes that are the biological basis for the chronic relapsing disease of addiction. Whatever substance caused the addiction, it has common features, such as receptor downregulation that gives rise to tolerance, withdrawal symptoms, and craving. The disease also has a social context, a genetic, or if you prefer, a gene environment stress interactive component, and significant comorbidity with other mental and physical disorders. Food addiction is thus part of, and indeed further confirmation of, the Kuhnian revolution in addiction neuroscience that I have dubbed the NIDA brain disease paradigm. So, what's the evidence? In addition to dopamine D2 receptor downregulation, imaging studies show that reward cues activate the same neural pathways in different addictions. The scan of female food addicts shown milkshakes look like those of alcoholics, shown pictures of alcoholic beverages. Naltrexone studies are also suggestive. Naltrexone has been used in treating compulsive overeating. It originally was used for treating heroin addiction, but it's been used for treating compulsive overeating, as well as compulsive gambling, shopping, alcoholism, as we heard last night, and sexual activity. Naltrexone blocks opioid receptors and suppresses dopamine activity in humans and animals, including rats that eat less of their beloved chocolate. That the same antagonist should have the same suppressive effect in different addictive behaviors suggests a common neurochemical basis. Third, food addicts look like other addicts because addictions are often substitutable. The greater the body mass index of obese patients, the less likely they are to use alcohol or other drugs. Conversely, when smokers or other drug users become abstinent, they often gain weight, frequently by eating sweets. For example, David Carr, the late journalist, reported that his weight ballooned to 300 pounds, or 136 kilograms, during 6 months of therapeutic community treatment for alcoholism and cocaine addiction. My addiction found expression in white flour and sugar, he wrote. He had a donut habit that reduced him to wearing sweatpants from the swag pile. Less poetically, drugs compete with food for brain reward sites. As they say in AA, if you want to stay sober, don't get too hungry. You should also avoid bariatric surgery. Alcohol abuse rises significantly during the second postoperative year, particularly among younger male patients familiar with alternative brain rewards of smoking, drinking, or taking drugs. Narcotic addicts can find themselves cut off in non-surgical ways. When a 3-day blizzard in New Haven, Connecticut trapped methadone patients indoors, they made do by drinking alcohol or swallowing sugar cubes. Some of the addicts even melted the sugar cubes in their cookers and shot up. They were skin popping. Historical sources offer similar clues. Here's a physician's observation about addicts and chocolate bars at the New York City Narcotic Clinic, which practiced gradual reduction therapy until it closed in 1920. Years ago, when I read these words, I thought, aha, that's why addicts have such bad teeth. Now I recognize another interpretation: concurrent or substitutive use of 2 drugs that affect opioid receptors. By the way, blocking these same receptors with antagonists produces, you guessed it, less consumption of narcotics and sweets. Fourth, food addicts look like other addicts because their social and genetic risk factors overlap. Consider the literature on reward deficiency syndrome. This idea specifies that defective genes and difficult life circumstances, such as constant stress or social defeat, deprive many people of their normal quota of dopamine D2 receptors that mediate pleasure responses. People with this syndrome feel uncomfortable or depressed until they discover that alcohol or drugs or sugar or gambling or some other thrilling behavior can temporarily banish their blues. Thus, they end up on a self-medicating treadmill. Addicts may also lack a specific presynaptic D2 receptor that provides inhibitory feedback, making it harder for them to apply the behavioral brakes when stimulated by addictive substances and behaviors. Frequent resort to these same substances and behaviors further undermines addicts' hedonic control systems and eventually compromises other parts of their brains. It also weakens the control systems of their offspring. In animals, high-fat consumption during pregnancy alters dopamine and opioid gene expression in offspring, enhancing their preferences for highly palatable foods. In humans, the children of obese, pregnant mothers whose diets are rich in fat and sugar are at higher risk of insulin resistance, obesity, and, interestingly, ADHD. The last trait, ADHD, is linked to higher risk of other addictive behaviors, from smoking to compulsive internet use. Mom's diet, in short, can really mess you up. These findings add a new dimension to our understanding of class and inequality. This is a poor neighborhood in Hartford, Connecticut, not far from where I used to live. We know the competing narratives. Socially, these people are stuck at the bottom of the ladder because of their appearance or their gender or their ethnicity or their bad educations. They're trapped in a deindustrialized city that's walled off by affluent suburbs. Culturally, they've been socialized into self-defeating attitudes. Genetically, assortative mating has raised the chances of less educable offspring, and so on. But now we have something new and compounding, an epigenetic case that maternal diets rich in hyperpalatable foods can cause or reinforce traits that further diminish the life chances of poor children. We warn pregnant women about excessive alcohol consumption, points out researcher Carolyn Davis. Shouldn't we also warn them about the dangers of what she calls tongue not entirely in cheek, fetal sugar spectrum disorder? Or maybe we should do something more than warn them, as New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg attempted in his abortive, or perhaps premature, 2012-2013 campaign against large sugary drinks. Admittedly, neuroscience research on food and addiction, or for that matter, on drugs and addiction, has yet to yield a large number of dramatic treatment breakthroughs. But cures often lag behind etiological insights, sometimes by decades or even centuries. For now, what addiction neuroscience has given us, I think, are two important pieces of information. One is that certain foods like sugar can produce in certain people effects on brain and behavior that are similar to those of addictive drugs. The other is that food addiction is part of a family of addictions that some researchers call pathological learning. Addiction is a memory. It's a reflex, Chuck O'Brien has said. It's training your brain in something which is harmful to yourself, or having your brain trained. For the deeper truth is that we live in a world nominally dedicated to progress and health, but in fact dedicated to getting us to consume in ways that are unprogressive and unhealthful. The point of Banksy's brilliant Angel of the North. This social contradiction is what neuroscience alone cannot explain. This is what makes Michael Moss's book so valuable. It shows how profit-maximizing food processors in a ruthlessly competitive global industry must embrace the virtues, for them anyway, of salt, sugar, and fat. People buy what makes them feel good. And in the words of one of the food scientists whom Michael Moss interviewed, feeling good means tasting good. Sociologists call this process McDonaldization. Like the fare served in fast food restaurants, the processed food in grocery and convenience stores has been standardized, industrialized, globalized, and scientifically designed to maximize brain reward and corporate profits. The paradox of McDonaldization is that economic rationality begets social irrationality. For food like this means more compulsive overeating, more obesity, diabetes, hypertension, diseases of the heart, liver, and kidneys, and premature senescence. The McDonaldization of goods and services has occurred, moreover, in several industries. Read Natasha Schull's Addiction by Design and Alan Brandt's Cigarette Century alongside Moss, and you will see a pattern. And that pattern is the hedonic weaponization of products in the gambling, tobacco, and food industries. In fact, multinational tobacco companies have been acquiring and transferring their marketing methods to the very food industries that Moss indicts. If you thought cigarette advertisers were the only ones targeting young, malleable consumers, think again. In the brave new world of limbic capitalism, it's pathological learning all the way down. All right, that was the case for the strong analogy. Let me now turn to 5 objections to the strong analogy. And I think each of these objections can be answered with a yes, but reply that usefully qualifies but does not overturn the analogy. So the first rebuttal, the most obvious one, is that we have to eat while we don't have to take drugs. Yes, but we don't have to eat hyperpalatable foods, which is why Kessler put a carrot on the cover of his book next to a piece of carrot cake. We don't overconsume corn. We overconsume corn processed into Cheetos and Doritos, synthetically flavored products that have as many as 34 ingredients. What the activists do concede is that the necessity of eating makes treating food addiction inherently tricky. The solutions are workarounds like measured low-fat ingredients or avoiding fructose, a tons of fun additive that no biochemical reaction actually requires. Rebuttal 2. Consuming hyperpalatable food usually does not lead to addiction. Yes, but that is true of all drugs. Volkov points out that fewer than 20% of the people who ever use heroin or crack wind up as addicts. More people than that have trouble controlling food intake, compromising their health in the process, which raises in her mind the possibility that some foods are actually more addictive than hard drugs. Now, personally, I doubt whether this is true. And even if it were, a substance's addictive potential does not, in and of itself, determine prevalence. Availability, price, and susceptibility are critical. Processed foods are cheaper and more widely available than processed drugs, particularly in food deserts where people tend to have more addiction risk factors anyway. This could explain why, in the aggregate, we have more control problems with food than with drugs, even if yummy food produces smaller spikes in dopamine levels than, say, a substance like heroin. Another counter is that heavy or excessive consumption is not necessarily addiction. Yes, but this is true for all potentially addictive substances and behaviors. People can gamble too much without being compulsive about it. However, regular heavy consumption can develop into addiction. There are more alcoholics in the top 10% of U.S. alcohol consumers who average more than 4 drinks a day than in the next 10% who average between 2 and 4 drinks a day. But when you control for factors like age, weight, and gender, the second 10% are more likely to become alcoholics than the people who drink little or no alcohol. That's why we call them at-risk drinkers. Well, by the same token, there are at-risk foodies. Regular heavy consumption, which, to repeat, causes changes at the cellular and molecular level, including altered gene expression, is a slippery slope that can descend from use to abuse to addiction. That has a chilling implication. Write policy experts Mark Kleiman, Jonathan Calkins, and Angela Hawken. When we create a illicit industry selling an abusable drug, the resulting businesses will have a strong profit incentive to create and sustain abusive consumption patterns because people with substance abuse disorders consume most of the product. They were writing about marijuana legalization, yet the same commercial logic applies to the McDonaldized food industry. That leads to the next rebuttal. Grant that some morbidly obese people are food addicts with a brain disease who run up a big food bill. They are nevertheless outliers. Nearly a third of the world's people are overweight or obese, and they aren't all addicts. Doing something about the obesity crisis requires re-engineering the nutritional environment, not more chapters of Food Addicts Anonymous. The basic problems are such things as food deserts, food industry subsidies, increasing sedentism, increasing portion sizes, caloric content and convenience, and cultural legitimation and overindulgence through what one critic calls a climate of abundance, aggressive advertising, and easy accessibility. To this, I have two yes buts. First, important medical historical trends are overdetermined. No historian would expect food addiction to be the sole or even the main culprit in so-called globesity, the global epidemic of obesity. Nor to my knowledge has any food addiction authority proposed a one-cause explanation. On the contrary, the literature indicates that the majority of obese patients do not, let me repeat that, do not meet the clinical criteria for food addiction. But the case that food acts like an addictive drug no more requires that all obese people be addicts than the case for handgun control requires that all homicide victims die from gunshot wounds. Even Stanton Peele, a tireless critic of the brain disease model, concedes that some people become so dependent on overeating for emotional gratification and pay such a steep price for it that they, and these are his words, fulfill more or less closely the criteria for addiction. In other words, a thing can be real and yet not a modal type. Second, brain disease advocates from Alan Leshner on have said that addiction has a social context. Now, frankly, initially they did not pay much attention to that social context, putting their research energy and grant dollars into lab work. But of late, they have begun to pay something more than lip service to social factors. Volkoff, in particular, has become an eloquent critic of hyper-stimulating food environments. She has even admitted to her own irresistible eating cue, namely ads for chocolate. Volkoff also has an argument that is, if not quite irresistible, at least credible and compelling, evidence of altered neurochemistry. It makes her warnings about hyperpalatable food more persuasive, much as health warnings about tobacco became more persuasive after 1950 when several scientific studies linked smoking to cancer. Indeed, we may be in the 1950s of food addiction. Early days, but with more damning evidence to come. Unquestionably, the food industry is well aware of its vulnerability to tobacco-style litigation. Finally, there is the suspicion that food addiction, like other addictions, is a social construction that serves the interests of specific groups. Grant seekers, pharma, perhaps obese people who find it useful to take on the role and assume the language of addicts. Even the food industry has a stake in the scientific addiction model, insofar as it can say, oh, well, let's identify and warn the handful of people who are genetically vulnerable to food addiction and then carry on business as usual with the masses. Those of you who are familiar with the history of the gambling and alcohol industries will recognize this gambit. Yes, But what disease doesn't have an element of social construction, or constituencies that gain or lose from shifts in social meaning, official definition, and views about incidence, prevalence, and etiology? Medical historians have understood as much since their discipline took a social turn in the 1960s and the 1970s. But few medical historians would ignore a disease's pathophysiology or dismiss its genetic factors, which may be socially influenced, but which are not socially fabricated. A comparison to autism comes to mind. Is it overdiagnosed? Probably. Is it hyped? Yes. Is it a source of revenue for activists and researchers and clinicians? Yes, it is. Is it a neurodevelopmental disorder or spectrum of disorders of genetic and possibly environmental origin that disrupts the lives of children and their families? You bet it is. And to overlook this dimension would be both unsympathetic and unscientific. So that is how I've come to think about food addiction. Is there a faddish element? Yes. Are there empire builders? Yes. Is it nevertheless real? Yes. As real as any other addiction, with these caveats. Finding none of the objections fatal, I would recast them as qualifications to a promising line of inquiry, and stay tuned for further developments. So how good is the analogy of my title? Combine the work of anthropologists and historians, we saw it first, with the more recent findings of psychologists, neuroscientists, public health physicians, and journalists, and it seems to be a very good analogy, so long as it is not deployed in a simplistic or crudely reductive way. This affirmative answer leads to one final consideration. If hyperpalatable foods pose many of the same risks as psychoactive drugs, does the history of drug policy tell us anything about the prospects for reforming food policy? I believe that it does. Drug policy has been dominated by two problems: the overregulation or outright prohibition of some psychoactive drugs, and the under-regulation or frank commercialization of others. Thus, in the mid-20th century, it was possible for the actor Robert Mitchum to do prison time for pot possession, while Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra smoked and drank with impunity, at least until one succumbed to lung cancer, the other to his third heart attack. For half a century, public health reformers challenged this double standard, seeking a convergent system of control with a more rational mix of regulations, taxes, and sanctions for different psychoactive substances. They lost some battles, they won others. Their most successful campaign, and the one most pertinent to the overconsumption of highly palatable food, was the long struggle to discourage tobacco use and to rein in its marketing. Tobacco control expert Kenneth Warner, who prepared this graph, thinks tobacco's lessons for food reform is the need for patience and regulatory persistence. No one-time fix will resolve the obesity crisis. Progress will come incrementally, opportunistically, and against entrenched corporate opposition. Yet, Warner argues, the cumulative effect of junk food taxes, mass media campaigns, restrictions on advertising, and improved product labeling, all measures with close tobacco history parallels, can similarly bend the obesity curve in a downward arc. Of course, libertarians will object to such proposals as nanny statism, the charge they gleefully leveled at Bloomberg, who became, quite literally, the poster child for paternalism run amok. Yet Bloomberg, who you will recall also had a strong track record against tobacco, acted consistently and on the basis of scientific evidence. His claims about sugar content and obesity and diabetes were grounded in medicine. They're not simply ideological claims. It was and is reasonable to intervene in the free market, in truth, the subsidized market, in unhealthful and potentially addictive foods, just as it is reasonable to intervene in the market for tobacco and other drugs. I say this because both types of products can cause significant harms to consumers and burdensome externalities for the rest of us. I trust that I have demonstrated that some, though by no means all, of food's potential harms are of an addictive character. Thank you for your attention.
I guess my question for you is this. In the area that I work, which is hypersexuality, we're dealing with hyperstimulation as a goal, as the endpoint or the goal for the client, in terms of escape, association, whatever they're seeking from the high, if you will. I would imagine with binge eaters, they're looking for hypersatiation or some kind of more of an opiate type of effect. But my question to you is this, is that when I talk about sex addiction, I'm thinking about everything but sex. I'm thinking about the desire for it, the looking for it, the search, the whole lead-up anticipatory fantasy to the actual event. And when I think about the person who picks up a quart of Haagen-Dazs, I think about somebody who, I guess my question to you is this, are they experiencing the same kind of neurochemical cascade of behavioral and emotional change prior to pulling that ice cream out of the freezer at the store, or are they simply achieving the high or the hypersatiation when they are sitting in front of the TV eating it?
They're certainly anticipating the high. I've been, as part of my research, I have been reading a lot of memoirs of food addicts. And one of the things that strikes me is that it's not just the moment of eating the Haagen-Dazs, it's thinking about it. It's waking up in the morning and starting to visualize the menu of the restaurant at which you're going to be eating lunch that afternoon, and then just obsessing over that menu. So I think that is probably a parallel between sex addiction and food addiction, is the obsessive dimension of it. And certainly the role of cues and so on.
Thank you, Dave. That was a really fascinating talk. I'm just wondering about this equation of food and drug, and whether you've ever thought if there anything to be learned by thinking of drugs as food. I mean, can you turn it around? Is there anything we know about food that would help enlighten our understanding of drugs?
That was a point that I touched on briefly in the first part of the presentation. Let's not forget that many of the substances from which we derive drugs have also historically provided valuable nutrients to human populations. And so, yeah, that's very much a part of it.
I guess what I'm getting at, are there ways that we've learned to deal with food problems, eating problems, that might have some analogy to the ways we might deal with drug problems? Is there a two-way street here?
Historically, most of the food addict treatment programs take Alcoholics Anonymous as their model, quite consciously. And chronologically, Alcoholics Anonymous is something that starts in the 1930s, and most of these food groups are post-World War II phenomena. So I would say that the causality runs more from drugs to food than the other way around.
I was wondering if given this broad view that you have of all these different addictive behaviors, do you think it makes sense to think about addiction as a characteristic of market capitalism rather than a characteristic of the brain? Is that an implication of what you're saying?
Yes, and I think that's also where neuroscience is missing the boat. I think that the only way to understand this really at a deep level is historically and technologically. We just live in a different world. I mean, once upon a time, people took opium in the form of pills that were highly adulterated, and they swallowed them and they ingested them. And now they have drugs that they can inject that are 100 times more powerful. That's just, it's more than an order of magnitude change. Capitalism and technology have been real game changers, and that might be, in fact, I think it is one reason why we live in an age of addiction.
Hi, I treat a lot of alcoholics and drug addicts, and the alcoholics routinely will express a lot of surprise that for the first time in their life they not only have a sweet tooth, but specifically focused on ice cream. And I've never been able to find any literature to explain that, but it's a regular recurring phenomenon. I've also recently, among my opioid addicts, found that there's a whole almost social relationship between them around particular kind of sour candies. Do you have any awareness of literature about those?
Yes. One of my slides showed a book that was edited by Brunel and Gold, recently published by Oxford University Press. And there are quite a few articles in that anthology that deal with the sweet tooth of alcoholics and other addicts and the substitutability of those drugs. So yes, there is a literature on that subject.
Thank you so much for validating what I know experientially to be absolutely true. But I'm a little concerned. Bill and Dr. Bob established Alcoholics Anonymous just shortly after Prohibition failed miserably to regulate alcohol in the U.S. And to go to regulation of sugar or any other substance concerns me that we are villainizing or criminalizing something that may be a legitimate disorder. Can you speak to that?
I didn't stand up here and say that I think we ought to move to Volstead Act style prohibitions of sugary beverages and so on. But there is a spectrum of coercion, there is a spectrum of regulation, and from a public health point of view, can you move up that spectrum of coercion and stop short of something like the prohibition of the 1920s? And as near as I can tell from the literature, yes, that is an option, and over time it can potentially change something like the prevalence of obesity.
I've got a question, but I want to start with a request.
Okay?
Would you just stop it? Your clear thinking makes the rest of us look so bad that I just want to go home and eat a quart of ice cream. So here's the question. You used the term foodie at one point to refer to people with food addictions.
No, well, okay, go ahead.
But it's got a different meaning. And in fact, almost an opposite meaning, in the sense that the people who are foodies generally don't overeat. And there's a hypothesis out there that part of the McDonaldization process is to make sure that all these highly energy-dense foods aren't that rewarding, so you need a lot of them to feel satisfied. And that if you could pack more flavor into less food, people would want to eat less. So that suggests a different approach from simply warning people about food addiction, but trying to repackage foods to be more satisfying and less caloric, which again is what the foodies seem to be up to. Now, as somebody who just likes a lot of calories, I find foodiness unbelievably boring. But that's not to say it's not a good idea.
Okay, I apologize for the bad pun, the use of the word foodies, but the larger point, which I think you would agree with, is that there is a spectrum of risk. And if you consume a lot of McDonaldized food, you are at a higher risk of developing food addiction than if you're a beans and leafy vegetable kind of person.
I think we have time for one more question.
Again, thanks for the great talk, David. I wanted to play off the question about market capitalism. Just anecdotally, if you go from the Midwest United States, where I live, to somewhere like Italy or France or in parts of Central America, you seem to see far fewer obese people just in the course of going around. So has any work been done on, market capitalism has pretty much saturated the globe, but is its effect in producing addiction uneven, or are there other factors? I mean, for example, if you eat a Mediterranean diet, does that not only make you healthier, but also provide some protection against this kind of addiction?
Okay, I have off the top of my head, I have no knowledge of any recent studies of something like food addiction in a country like, say, France. I can tell you, though, that the idea that some countries were immune from the obesity epidemic, that's very much 1980s thinking. The more recent evidence shows that there have been significant weight gains even in countries that supposedly had good food discipline, and so that's definitely changing.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.